Okay, so let's get this started. Very, very large topic that we're covering today, why the future is fraudulent. But I want to give you maybe a very high level of understanding of where we're going with fraud, what's happening in the fraud landscape, and why we should care about it. So before we start, my name is Simon Marchand. I'm the Chief Fraud Prevention Officer for Nuance. And my main focus is to develop biometrics technology that can identify fraudsters and authenticate users. So the goal is really to find a unique element of someone's identity that we can use seamlessly to authenticate them, but also use the same technology to identify fraudsters and try to very quickly, during an interaction, determine if the individual that we're speaking with or interacting with is someone we should be doing business with. And all of this is driven mostly by what customers want today. The needs of customers and their expectations are changing quite significantly over time. And lately, what we have seen is that security, privacy, and transparency of the interactions are really at the core of what customers want. One of the main reasons for that is that they hear more and more in the news and in the media about the issues that pertains to fraud and identity theft. They are more aware than ever of what SIM swap means and identity fraud and synthetic identities. And as we see consumers being more and more educated on those topics, we see that they want more security when they're dealing with an organization or when they're using an app or a service. They want to make sure that the information that they're providing or sharing is secure within the confines of that app or service. But they also want to make sure that that information isn't shared, even willingly, without them being properly been notified or without giving consent. And finally, they want every security interaction to be faster and more transparent. So what drives that knowledge of the fraud landscape is really what's been happening in the past couple of years. And I want to show you just a couple of data points to really illustrate how fraudsters have changed the way they do things. The first is how data breaches have grown in the past couple of years. You can see that starting in 2013, we start seeing more and more very important data breaches with a huge shift in trends in 2017, 2018, where even though this might seem like a dip in the number of events, it actually represents a huge increase in the number of records compromised. So fraudsters are going now after credit bureaus, credit card issuers, banks, entire government services. That means that virtually speaking, everyone's identity is out there up for grab, and customers know that, consumers know that, and they want to make sure that by sharing information with a new organization or with a new service, they will not increase the risks of seeing that identity being used against them. And we can see that 2020 was an all-time high. That's, of course, being driven by COVID-19 and how fraudsters have very heavily relied on that chaos and uncertainty and all of the anxiety from the pandemic to fish more effectively for additional information. So they now have a gold mine of personal information they can use everywhere, whether it's to take over bank accounts, to open telco accounts, to take over a cryptocurrency wallet. All of this should be of concern now. At the same time, we see that not only are data breaches going up, but identity theft cases are going up. And they've been going up steadily since the early 2000s. As banks and retailers were securing the payment ecosystem, most notably by deploying the chip cards, but also with all the kind of MasterCard secure code and verified by Visa services that add that layer of security, fraudsters have to shift what they're doing. And with the availability of personal information, we see that they're heavily going after identities, mostly because it allows them to more effectively monetize their activity. It brings more money in. It might be even easier, and it doesn't require the same level of specialization as before. You can just go on the dark web, purchase 1,000 different identities for a couple dollars each, and then you can use it to obtain a credit card, open a bank account, obtain a free, high-end device at a telco, and resell it. So it's very, very easy for them to now use that information. 2020 was the all-time high in the past 20 years. And 2021 is really looking like it's going to be an all-time high also. The numbers you see here are all only for the first 3 quarters of the year. So most definitely, identity theft is an issue, and the information that fraudsters need to take over account is out there. So any service that we build, any offering that we want to put together has to take this into consideration. If the information is out there, our users and customers are eventually at risk of seeing that service being taken over. So whether it's a digital identity wallet that you're creating, whether it's a cryptocurrency wallet, anything that has some sort of value or can even be an enabler for other crimes will be a target of fraudsters. And I just want to add real quick that some of the reasons why our government failed also, relating to digital to identity theft in the past couple of years, but mostly in the past year, is because there is definitely a lack of proper up-to-date identification methods in governments, which drives very, very heavily the adoption of digital identity. In the past 2 years, we've seen governments very, very quickly shift towards digital national identity, which opens up a whole lot of new opportunities for a lot of startups to build digital identity wallets for those governments who might not have the interest to develop the technology. They know they want their citizens to be protected by a digital identity, but they don't quite know how to do it. They don't have that expertise. So if we want to be able to play in that field, we need to understand what are the gaps of current identities versus digital identities, and also be aware that the level of trust we need to build with our customer base needs to be the highest possible. Which brings us to one crucial element of proper identification and authentication, which is biometrics. Biometrics has seen quite a significant increase in adoption in the past couple months. And you can see here, 48% of customers are adopting biometrics, or an increase in 48% in adoption, which means that customers more than ever trust biometrics. They understand what the role of biometrics is to protect their information and identity, which opens an opportunity for us to integrate biometrics in whatever platform we have, not only to secure the authentication process and to make the platform more secure, but also to facilitate the authentication process. If you have to enter a password and then receive an SMS, not only is it not secure, it's also a lot of friction. It's also, adding delays for the consumer to be able to log in and use an app or use a web service. So using biometrics is really a way to remove all sorts of knowledge element. You don't have to remember a PIN or a password. You can really just focus on what you are, provide that information, and then move forward. So when we talk about biometrics, we talk about mostly 5 big technologies. Facial recognition, we all know what it is. The problem with facial recognition it's heavily relying on the hardware. You need to have a device that has an up-to-date camera to make sure that it's not going to be spoofed. And you need to have a device. So if you develop a service that aims, for example, at bringing senior citizens on board and provide them with specific services, if they don't have a smartphone, or if they don't show up in person where you have a camera, how do you protect them with that level of security? If you have a mask, for example, how do you make sure that it is still sufficiently accurate to be secure? Then we have fingerprints. Of course, fingerprints are ubiquitous. We use them to unlock our phones all the time. Again, relying very heavily on hardware. You need to have a fingerprint reader somewhere. So if you want to guarantee the highest level of accessibility to your services and the highest level of security, regardless of what hardware is available, it brings you to 3 different types of biometrics. The first is behavioral, which doesn't focus on which specific device you're using, but really how you interact with the device. How do you hold your phone? At what angle? How do you type? How do you swipe on the phone? All of this can be used to profile a user. It's transparent. It's embedded in the app. It's embedded in a web service. If you're using your mouse a certain way, if you're typing a certain way. And again, doesn't rely on specific hardware. It's really about how you interact with any device. Voice biometrics is interesting because it is device agnostic. So we create a unique voice print based on about 1,000 parameters of how I sound. What makes me unique? And that's language agnostic. So I could be speaking French, English, or even a made-up language. The sound of my voice is still the same. It's still unique to me. I can be calling directly on my mobile phone, on a wireline. I could be in an app. I could be in a Skype session, in a Teams session, on WhatsApp. As soon as you have audio, regardless of where it's coming from, it's going to work just as well. as any other channels, which makes it very, very easy to use regardless of who the population is, regardless of what the channel of interaction is. Again, you could use it in an app, you could use it in a call center, you could use it in an IVR. You can use it as a two-factor authentication element. So you could, instead of sending a one-time password, push for a two-factor authentication that prompts a user to speak a short sentence. And by doing that, you're really tying all of your channels together. You're allowing users to have a single profile and use the same biometric factor. And finally, I want to talk about conversational biometrics, which doesn't rely at all on the sound of your voice and how you sound when you speak, but really focuses on the words you're using. It focuses on the specific vocabulary, the pacing of your sentence, the theme of your conversation, the intent you're communicating, the words you're choosing to get to an end result. And that works with spoken words, but also with written words. If you're in a chat session, if you're sending an email, everything you write can be used to profile you, and it can be used to identify fraudsters who might be following a script, for example. So all of these three technologies can be deployed across any channel. They can be used across any type of devices. And that's really how you make any kind of platform more secure. That's how you build trust. That's how you build credibility when you're interacting with, a customer base that might not know you. And if you're offering a service that's very, very, high sensitivity, such as a digital identity or cryptocurrency wallet, then you really want to be able to have that level of trust, attached to your product. Which brings us to the next topic. I want to talk about some of the use cases that we see with this, and the goal being monitor individuals, monitor human beings, try to identify who the human being is. And instead of asking for password, instead of asking for security questions and pins. So by using this, there are tons of opportunities that you can leverage. You can, for example, use biometrics technology to open a banking account or a telco account or an insurance account. As soon as someone starts interacting with you, you can listen to what they say, you can monitor what they're doing, and you can look for fraudsters. Even if an individual is not an individual you've heard before, you can listen to the voice, match it against the fraudster watch list, and see if that person, regardless of what they're presenting, is the kind of individual you'd want to let in your service. So very, very useful in an environment where like I said, a lot of personal information is out there. A fraudster can present you any kind of information. They can have stolen any kind of credentials, email addresses. They could have built a synthetic identity, using the flaws of credit files. So how do you make sure they are not a fraudster? You monitor everything that's happening. You check against the centralized fraudster watch list. You can use it to provide IDs to law enforcement, for example, so digital identity wallet. You can use it to authenticate someone who wants to receive government services or any kind of services online, over the phone, or even in person. You can use that technology to authenticate with universities. We see more and more remote learning scenarios. How do you make sure the person taking a specific exam is the student that should be taking that exam? Well, you can use biometrics for that. You can also provide age verification. And we'll talk a little more about attribute sharing a little later. But you can provide very specific attributes of a person without having to share specific information. So you can increase privacy when you do proper biometrics implementation. And you can use this as your strongest form of two-factor authentication. Again, you don't want to use SMS because we know that SIM swaps are there and they're easy to perform for fraudsters. We don't want to use one-time passwords because we know that malware such as T-Bot or SharkBot more recently, they're very present. We know that fraudsters are using them to intercept any kind of one-time password. So those passwords that can be easily reused should be replaced with biometrics factors. If what you ask of a person is for them to speak, fraudsters cannot imitate or synthesize a voice well enough that they would bypass that security measure, etc. So let's talk about two main use cases. The first is, protecting the app and sharing attributes, which I think is very interesting as we move in a world where people are more and more concerned with privacy. They want to limit the information they're sharing in an interaction. Being able to use your voice to provide a piece of information, really certifies that the information is correct, is accurate, belongs to the person, but it also ensures that you don't share what you don't have to share. So if someone needs to verify your age, for example, you can simply pull your app, open a digital identity wallet, speak a very short sentence that's tied to that digital identity. My voice confirms my identity, for example, and then generate a proof of age. That proof of age doesn't need to pass any kind of personal information. You don't need to show the date of birth. You don't need to show the name. You don't need to show anything. If a biometrics factor allows to provide for that attribute, the person that needs to validate that information can have the certainty that this person that they're interacting with is allowed to move forward. So you're really protecting privacy, but also providing that very high level of security and certainty that the person in front of you is the right person. A second use case that you can think about is facilitating portability. And I mean by that, what if you have a very sensitive application tied to a device and you have a trusted device, and now someone shows up and they purchase a new device. Not only do they purchase a new device, they do it with a new carrier. They have a new SIM card. They, of course, have a new IMEI or serial number, but they have a new phone number. How do you know that you can trust this new device before you port the application? Especially if the first device is lost, for example, and you cannot verify that information with your current user reliably. So what you can do, for example, is check for voice biometrics. Prompt the person to say, my voice confirms my identity, check against a centralized database. And by doing that, you're tying that biometrics check to the user, and you can safely transfer the app or transfer, for example, a digital identity wallet to a new device. And that's really the kind of transparency that we want to build by using biometrics. It's the high level of security, but the high level of speed and transparency in authenticating users. And I think with the kind of future that we're looking at, where fraudsters are more clever than ever, more agile, more specialized than they've ever been, and when we're looking at a future that has millions or tens or hundreds of millions of personal information out there, we really want to be able to establish trust and credibility when we develop new services. Biometrics is one way to do it if we find the right partners to do so. So thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate your time. I've left my information there on the screen. So if you have any kind of question, feel free to connect with me. I'm always happy to discuss how we can improve security with apps and web services and others. So thank you very much, and have a very nice end of event at UPPSTART.